Put on your red shoes and dance the blues. I should have no feeling. This feeling. Just as you take my hand, just as you write my number down.
Some of the greatest rock albums ever made were treated like garbage the day they came out, not ignored, actively disliked. Critics tore them apart, labels panicked. Fans who had shown up expecting one thing got something completely different and walked away furious. And then slowly, sometimes over years, sometimes over decades, the world caught up. These are 10 iconic rock albums that everybody hated until they didn't. Number 10, Led Zeppelin III, 1970. Led Zeppelin had spent 2 albums building a reputation as the heaviest band on the planet. The first record hit like a freight train. Led Zeppelin II doubled down. Whole Lotta Love. The riffs were enormous, so when the third album showed up in October of 1970, people expected more of the same. What they got was a bunch of guys sitting around with acoustic guitars. Jimmy Page had gone to a cottage in Wales called Bron-Yr-Aur with Robert Plant after the second album tour and came back obsessed with folk music and fingerpicking. The electric guitars were still there, but they had to share the room with mandolins and songs that sounded more like Joni Mitchell than Whole Lotta Love. Rolling Stone went after it. Other critics followed. The album still sold millions because it was Led Zeppelin, but the conversation was disappointment. People called it soft. People said Page had lost his nerve. 50 years later, Led Zeppelin III is the album that musicians cite more than any other in their catalog. Jack White has described it as a turning point in his understanding of how acoustic and electric music can coexist. The songs that confused people in the 70s, Tangerine, That's the Way, Friends, are now considered some of the most beautiful things the band ever recorded. Page and Plant were just moving faster than their audience could follow. Number 9, Black Sabbath, the Black Sabbath album, 1970. Black Sabbath released their debut on Friday the 13th of February, 1970. The label picked the date on purpose. The cover was a woman standing in front of a decaying building, looking like she had wandered out of a horror film, and the music sounded exactly like that cover looked. Tony Iommi's guitar tone was lower, heavier, and darker than anything on the radio. The opening track started with rain, a tolling bell, and a tritone riff that the medieval church had literally called the Devil's Interval. Ozzy Osbourne sang over it like he was narrating his own nightmare. It was slow, it was ugly, it was completely on purpose. Critics could not stand it. Lester Bangs dismissed it as a shuck and called them just like Cream, but worse. Rolling Stone dismissed it as talentless noise. Robert Christgau gave it a C-. The band from Birmingham with no connections and no art school credentials was treated like a joke by every publication that mattered. The fans did not care. The album hit number 8 in the UK, but critical respect took decades. It was not until the 80s and 90s, when the bands that grew up on Sabbath started filling arenas themselves, that the debut got its credit. Metallica, Slayer, Pantera, Soundgarden, every one of them pointed back to that first Sabbath record. The album critics called garbage turned out to be the foundation of an entire genre that has lasted over 50 years. Number 8, Fleetwood Mac, Tusk, 1979.
Why don't you ask if he's going to stay? Why don't you?
Rumors had sold over 40 million copies. Fleetwood Mac was the biggest band in the world, so when Lindsey Buckingham walked into the studio, Warner Brothers expected Rumors Part 2. Buckingham had other plans. He had been listening to punk, new wave, Talking Heads, and The Clash, and he was bored with repeating himself. He recorded tracks in his bathroom. He used lo-fi techniques on purpose. He convinced the band to hire the USC Trojan Marching Band to play on the title track.
If he's gone away,
The budget hit $1 million, which in '79 was almost unheard of. Tusk sold 4 million copies. For any other band, that would have been massive. For the band that made Rumors, it was treated like a catastrophe. The press called it self-indulgent. Fans who wanted another Dreams could not figure out what Buckingham was doing. Buckingham took the criticism hard. He later said it made him question everything about pushing boundaries inside a commercial band. But over the decades, Tusk quietly became the Fleetwood Mac album that other musicians respected most. Artists from Camper Van Beethoven to The National have cited it. The messy, unpredictable energy that confused people in '79 is exactly what makes it feel alive today. Rumors is the album everybody loves. Tusk is the album musicians keep going back to when they want to hear a band actually take a risk. Number 7, Nirvana, In Utero, 1993. Nevermind had turned Kurt Cobain into the biggest rock star on the planet, and he hated almost everything about it. The production was too clean. Frat guys were singing along to songs about alienation. When it came time to record the follow-up, Cobain wanted to burn the whole thing down. He hired Steve Albini. That choice alone told the industry what was coming. Albini was famous for recording bands raw, loud, and with zero interest in being radio-friendly. He had worked with the Pixies and Big Black. His name on a record meant abrasive on purpose. Cobain and the band flew to Pachyderm Studio in Minnesota and tracked the album in about 2 weeks. The guitars were harsh. The drums sounded like they were recorded in a concrete garage. Heart-shaped box sat next to tracks like Scentless Apprentice that sounded like the tape machine was having a seizure. Geffen Records heard the mixes and panicked. Newsweek questioned whether Cobain had deliberately sabotaged his own record. Walmart refused to carry it because of the artwork and song titles. The band remixed a couple of tracks with Scott Litt to get the label off their backs, but the core stayed raw. In Utero debuted at number 1 and sold nearly 5 million copies, but the narrative was that Cobain had fumbled the follow-up, too abrasive, not as catchy. It took years for people to hear it on its own terms. Now the conversation has flipped. Many fans and critics consider In Utero the better record, the one where Cobain was actually saying what he wanted to say, the way he wanted to say it, without anybody polishing the edges off. Number 6, The Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, 1966.
I may not always love you, but long as there are...
Brian Wilson had heard Rubber Soul, and it broke something open in his head. The Beatles had made an album where every track felt connected. Wilson decided the Beach Boys were going to answer it. He locked himself in the studio and started building something nobody around him understood. The rest of the band was on tour in Japan while Wilson recorded. He brought in the Wrecking Crew. He layered harpsichords, French horns, bicycle bells, and Coca-Cola cans filled with gravel. When the band came home, Mike Love reportedly asked,
Stars above you, you never need to doubt it.
"Who's gonna listen to this?" He wanted hit singles. Wilson had made something else entirely. Capitol Records gave it minimal promotion in the US. The label did not understand what Wilson had made and did not try very hard to figure it out. In the UK, the music press recognized it almost immediately, and the album went to number 2 on the British charts. But in America, it peaked at number 10, a major step down for the Beach Boys.
I'll make you so sure about it. God only knows.
The label put out a greatest hits compilation a few months later, which outsold Pet Sounds almost immediately. The message was clear. Capitol wanted the old Beach Boys back. Wilson never really recovered from the rejection. Watching it get brushed aside sent him into a spiral that derailed the even more ambitious Smile sessions. But the album kept growing. Paul McCartney has said more than once that God Only Knows is the greatest song ever written. Pet Sounds climbed to number 2 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums list. The record Capitol did not bother promoting is now considered one of the most important albums in the history of popular music. Before we continue, do me a favor, hit subscribe and tap the bell. That's it. That's the whole pitch. Now let's get back to it. Number 5. The Rolling Stones, Exile on Main Street, 1972.
What's the matter with your boy? He don't come around no more.
The Rolling Stones made Exile in a basement, literally. Keith Richards had rented a villa called Nelcote in the south of France because the band had fled England over tax issues. The sessions took place in the damp, cramped space underneath the house. Bad wiring, terrible acoustics. Mick Jagger was not always around because he was newly married and splitting his time between his wife and his band.
Is he checking out for show? Is he gonna close the door?
Richards ran things on a schedule that started at midnight and ended when whoever was still standing could no longer play. The result sounded exactly like the conditions in which it was made. Muddy, loose, vocals buried in the mix, guitar parts bleeding into each other, horns and piano showing up from nowhere and disappearing just as fast. When the double album came out in May of '72, critics heard a mess. The word sloppy kept showing up. After the tight punch of Sticky Fingers the year before, Exile felt like the Stones had wandered off into a swamp and forgotten to come back. The critical reappraisal started in the late 70s. Musicians kept talking about it. Guitarists kept going back to those buried riffs and finding new things. The looseness that critics called sloppy began to sound like authenticity. By the 90s, Exile was showing up at the top of greatest albums lists everywhere. The same record that people said lacked focus is now regularly called the greatest rock and roll album ever made. Turns out the mess was the point. Number 4, David Bowie, Low, 1977.
Put on your red shoes and dance the blues.
Bowie had spent the mid-70s in Los Angeles in rough shape. He made 2 brilliant albums during that stretch, Station to Station and Young Americans, but the lifestyle was destroying him. He moved to West Berlin in '76 to start over, rented an apartment above an auto parts store, and started making music with Brian Eno that sounded nothing like anything he had done before. Low was split in half. The first side had short, fractured pop songs with vocals that sounded distant, like Bowie was singing from the other end of a long hallway. The second side was almost entirely instrumental. Eno's synthesizers drifted over ambient landscapes closer to film scores than rock albums. No big choruses, no Ziggy Stardust theatrics, no soul review. Bowie had stripped everything away and rebuilt from a completely different set of blueprints. RCA Records wanted nothing to do with it.
Let's dance to the song they're playing on the radio.
They had been expecting another Young Americans, something they could push on the radio and sell to the massive audience Bowie had built. Instead, they got Sound and Vision, a gorgeous single that still sounded like it came from another planet. RCA reportedly tried to convince Bowie to shelve the album and record something more commercial. He refused. They released it in January of '77 with minimal enthusiasm. Critics were divided. Some recognized it immediately. Fans who had shown up for Ziggy and Aladdin Sane did not know what to do with ambient synthesizer pieces called Warsawa and Subterraneans. But over the following decades, Low became the Bowie album that other artists kept naming as their favorite. Trent Reznor, Tom York, James Murphy from LCD Sound System. Philip Glass liked it enough to compose a symphony based on it. The album RCA Wanted to Bury is now regularly called the best thing Bowie ever made. Number 3, Weezer, Pinkerton, 1996.
I should have no feeling. This feeling.
Weezer's debut had sold 3 million copies on the back of Buddy Holly and the Sweater Song. Rivers Cuomo was an unlikely rock star, a shy, awkward guy from Connecticut who wore thick glasses and wrote songs about feeling like an outsider. Rick Ocasek from The Cars produced it, giving it a shiny, radio-ready sound that made Cuomo's insecurities go down easy. Pinkerton was the opposite in every way. Cuomo produced it himself. The guitars were louder and messier. The lyrics were uncomfortably personal, covering loneliness.
Pain. Everything I need, deny me. Everything I want.
rejection, and his own failures with a level of honesty that made people squirm. Tracks like Across the Sea and El Scorcho laid out his inner life with zero distance between the feeling and the page. It sounded like somebody ripping pages out of their diary and screaming them into a microphone. Rolling Stone gave it a brutal review. Their readers voted it the third worst album of '96.
It's taken away from me, but who do I got to blame? Nobody but me, and I don't want.
Sales were a fraction of the debut. Cuomo later said the rejection nearly made him quit music. He retreated to Harvard, and Weezer went dark for years. Then the album refused to die. College kids and message board communities kept finding it and passing it around. By the early 2000s, Pinkerton had become one of the most influential guitar records of its generation. Emo bands from Dashboard Confessional to Jimmy Eat World pointed straight back to it. The record that nearly ended Cuomo's career turned into the one people love most. Rolling Stone later called it one of the best albums of the 90s. Number 2. Radiohead, Kid A, 2000.
Just as you take my hand, just as you write my number down.
OK Computer had turned Radiohead into the most acclaimed band in the world. Everyone assumed the follow-up would push further down that road. More anthems, more guitars. Tom York had a completely different idea. He had been listening to Aphex Twin, Autekri, and Boards of Canada. He walked into the studio and told the band he did not want to play guitar anymore. He did not want to write singles. If that meant abandoning everything that made OK Computer successful, so be it. The recording sessions were miserable.
Just as the drinks arrive, just as they play your favorite song.
The band nearly fell apart. Ed O'Brien kept a studio diary that painted a picture of confusion and frustration. York was in his own world, layering electronic textures and chopped up vocals and refusing to explain what he was going for. Kid A came out in October with no singles and no music videos. The title track sounded like a lullaby sung by a malfunctioning robot. Everything in its right place opened the album with a warped electric piano and York's voice cut into fragments. Idiotech was built around a sample from a 1973 Paul Lansky computer music composition. Rock critics did not know where to put it. Melody Maker said Radiohead had lost the plot. NME was lukewarm. Fans who wanted another Paranoid Android felt betrayed. It debuted at number 1 in both the UK and the US. But the conversation was all about career suicide. It took a few years for the consensus to flip. Pitchfork gave it a perfect 10. Time magazine named it the best album of the decade. The record people called a betrayal is now treated as the moment Radiohead proved they were the most important band of their generation. Number 1. The Velvet Underground and Nico, 1967.
I be your mirror, reflect what you are, in case.
1967 was the summer of love. Sgt. Pepper, The Doors on the radio. San Francisco was the center of the rock universe. And then there was this album which sounded like somebody had recorded a nervous breakdown in a New York City basement and pressed it onto vinyl. Andy Warhol produced it, sort of. His name was on the cover and he paid for the studio time, but his main contribution was telling the band to do whatever they wanted and adding the German singer Nico to the lineup. Lou Reed did not want her there. He had written these songs and now someone else was singing lead on 3 of them because Warhol thought her voice added something. The tension between Reed and Nico ended up giving the album a strange, unresolved quality that made it even more unsettling.
You don't know. I be the wind, the rain and the sun.
The songs covered the darker corners of New York street life. Compulsion, obsession, things people did not put in pop songs in '67. John Cale's viola sounded like it was being tortured. Reed's guitar on European Sun was pure noise for nearly 8 minutes. Venus in Furs used distortion and drone in ways that would not become mainstream for another 20 years. Nothing about this album fit with what was happening in popular music. The Beatles were singing about penny lanes and strawberry fields. The Velvet Underground was singing about the parts of the city you crossed the street to avoid. Radio ignored it completely. It sold an estimated 30,000 copies in its first 5 years. Sgt. Pepper sold 2.5 million in 3 months. The album was deleted from the Verve Records catalog within a couple of years. Lou Reed left the band in '70. Most people assumed that was the end of the story. Brian Eno said it best. The album only sold 30,000 copies, but everyone who bought it started a band. Punk came along in the mid-'70s, and the Velvet Underground's raw approach was suddenly the template. Post-punk treated it like scripture. Shoegaze, noise rock, alternative, indie, every one of those genres runs straight back to this record. David Bowie called it the most important album he ever heard. It reached number 13 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums list. The Velvet Underground and Nico failed on every conventional measure, and won on the only one that actually matters. It changed what music could be. It just took the rest of the world a couple of decades to figure that out. Those are 10 rock albums that the world got wrong the first time around. Critics buried them, labels fumbled them, fans rejected them, and every single one came back stronger than the records that outsold them. If we missed one that deserves a spot, put it in the comments. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We have plenty more to get into.